Hola. Mi llamo Alberti, non soy italiano, non soy español, soy inglés. Lo siento, non hablo español. So in English, I'm afraid, just for 30 minutes, and I have lots of nice pictures, so you can have a sleep and look at the pictures. I come from National Museum Scotland. We have 4 museums in and around Edinburgh. We have 3.5 million visits every year. This is the largest outside some town in the south called London that you may have heard of, I don't know. So we have 3.5 million visits to our 4 museums. We have 500 staff. My team is 130 collection staff, curators, conservators. We are scientists, archaeologists, historians, and art historians. So we also work with our volunteers, our research associates, and many students. But my happy place, the base where most of our 10 million natural specimens and our 2.6 million cultural artifacts is in our collection centre, which is just outside of Edinburgh. And here is where we undertake our research. Like other museums in the UK and Europe around the world, we research on our collections. And I want to define research at the beginning of today very simply. I take research to be the original investigation in order to gain knowledge. Original investigation to gain knowledge. Now that's a simple definition for what is a very complex task, as you know. But it's important to note, and I think what we are doing here today, which is very useful, is to note that museums not only communicate knowledge, but we generate knowledge. We don't only engage, we also research. And it's important, I think, to compare ourselves to other research bodies, to universities and research institutes, and to note that we do research, but we do it with different methods. We do it for different outputs and results, and we do it with different partnerships. Now, although these methods have changed, I think that museums have always undertaken research. Museums have always made knowledge. And just for the next 25 minutes, I want to do a tour of museums and research. I'll start with the history that I just mentioned. I will talk very briefly about the different methods. I'll then give examples of research from National Museum Scotland. 3 if I have time, certainly 2. Then I'll talk about results and outputs from research. And finally, I'll conclude by talking about value. So, in such an intelligent audience, you will already know that the roots of museums, the history of museums, is in cabinets, cameri of curiosity in the Renaissance in Europe. So we have here Olaus Worm in Copenhagen, and closer to home, Vincenzo Lastanosa's coin collection. Now these cabinets, cabinets of curiosity, were for display, they were to show off, but they were also to generate knowledge. It was different kinds of knowledge to what we have now, but it was knowledge nonetheless. The peak, however, and where most of our collections come from in Europe, was in the decades around 1900. So around about 1880 to maybe 1930, this huge expansion in European and North American museums. I give examples here of new buildings for these collections built all within about 5 years, around 1890. And these are usually at this point, I would ask you to identify them, but we're on the clock. We have no time for that, but you will see London, Vienna, Prague, Paris, and Chicago. And what they had in them were huge collections of archaeology, of natural history, of anatomy, and anthropology. And it was about this time that the museum started to separate collections for display and for the public, and collections, most of the collections for research, for study. They're kept separate. And still, this is the case to this day. If I can focus on natural history for a moment, this is from the American, in the United States, the National Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian, this picture. So the Natural History Museum in London has, now we are proud of our 10 million specimens. In London they have 80 million, 80 million. In the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., they have 150 million. And then around the world, we think around 2 billion natural science specimens. Now, less than 1%, tiny fraction is on display. The rest are there for research, or it's not worth having them at all. So, to take a step back and think about not only specimens, but also cultural artifacts. The way I think about museum research involves 5 loosely defined methods for studying collections. I won't go into detail, but in short, you can look at them. You can look at them beside images and texts. You can touch them and use them, and this is my former student, learning how to type on a historic typewriter. He's too young to remember using them, himself. You can compare them, and so the reason we have 2 billion natural history specimens is because we compare them. It's in the relationships between the specimens that they have value. We can look at them very closely with microscopes and scanners and CT scanners and so on. And we can analyze them. Destructive analysis, taking small samples of DNA, ancient DNA, environmental DNA, and so forth. Or you can take samples of, say, archaeological artifacts to understand their composition, what they're made of. And I will note that today I'm largely, this scheme for methods is largely focused on object research. Museums also undertake research, of course, into our audiences and into our practice and into our networks. But this is a focus, this scheme for methods is focusing on material study, whether natural history or cultural artifacts. So, I want to introduce 3 examples of research we are doing at, or involved in, or collaborating on in National Museum Scotland. The first is my own project, so I'm very proud of this and will probably talk most about my project, of course. And this is a project looking at how museums collect and display the Cold War, largely in Northern Europe. So at National Museum Scotland, we worked with the University of Stirling, where I'm affiliated. We worked with museums in England, the military museums, the Imperial War Museum, and the Air Force Museum. We worked with a partner museum in Norway, the Aviation Museum in Bøde in Norway. And we worked with a museum in Berlin, the Allied Museum. And so we looked at different collections, and we asked how they got there and why. And it may not surprise you, most collections, the most obvious collections, were military collections, especially aviation aircraft. This is a nuclear bomber we have at our aviation museum in Scotland. But we also looked at all the other sorts of material that, even though it wasn't always collected to represent the Cold War, we found a lot of material around design, art and design. We found a lot of social history material, and we found a lot of material around peace and protest. So we asked these broad questions of how the material came to be in museums, how museums have displayed it, and how they could display it. So it's a very practical, this is what I mean about museum research having different outputs. This project had practical outputs in that we put together an exhibition, which I'll come back to. And we also looked at, and I talked about audience research. We have, it's a 3-year project. We have, 2 months left, and we are talking to audiences. We are looking at how people respond to Cold War material on display. We look at the difference between those of us like me who remember the Cold War and those of us like many in the audience who are too young to remember the Cold War. And we're really interested in that difference. So we are looking at objects, we are looking at displays, and we're looking at audiences. We produced 2 books. This one here is the book that goes with the exhibition, and it came out in the summer. And the book on the right was published open access. We're very pleased about this. It can be accessed by anyone. And it was published on Friday. So we're very proud about that. It happened much faster than we thought. So we were rather taken by surprise, but that's accessible on the Routledge, the publisher's website. So with the one, we are looking to engage with a wider audience. We're looking to engage with visitors. It's available in the shop. It's about Cold War history in Scotland, whereas the other book is a collection of essays by different collaborators from across Europe and North America. It is much more an academic analysis. So we're trying to reach different audiences, different readerships with our research. And we have still in the museum an exhibition that goes on Cold War Scotland, so it goes with the book on the left. And this is, we are using it, it's not only a product of the research, it's also where we talk to the visitors. So it's like our laboratory for audience research. And this is my colleague Sarah Harper, who's actually doing the real work. She's the researcher. And so she helped put up the exhibition, and she is, as far as I know today, with students talking to visitors in the exhibition. We were originally going to stage it for 6 months. We say now that we will extend it by another 12 months, so if you're coming to Edinburgh, please come and visit. We say this is because of popular demand, because the audience love it. It's actually because, like many organizations in the UK, we have no money, so we can't afford to replace it right now. But this is what we call a silver lining on the dark cloud of the United Kingdom having no money. So, I'm doing okay. I will happily answer any questions about this project. As I say, it's very nearly at an end, and we are pleased with it. Another project that recently finished is very different. This is using not our history and technology collections. This is using our zoology collections. It's a project called Animal Feeding. It has a long title, Do Not Feed the Birds, Feed the Animals, but we call it animal feeding. Again, this is a collaboration. We do our best work in collaboration. This is with universities in Exeter, the University of Reading, and the University of Roehampton. And it's funded by the Wellcome Trust, who do a lot of funding of medicine and life science in the United Kingdom. But it's a multidisciplinary project, and they're looking at how humans feeding animals changes the biology of the animals. So this is one example. This is a chimpanzee, as you can see, called Choppers. Now, Choppers was a very famous chimpanzee in Britain because Choppers appeared on television in an advertisement, in an advert for tea. To anyone of my age in the UK, you will recognize Choppers because of the Tetley tea adverts. And we have the remains of Choppers. We have Choppers' skeleton. And we looked at the impact of, well, he didn't really drink the tea. This was not true. But we look at the impact of how he was fed in the zoo. And we have a complete biography of him from texts and from scientific analysis. So we used not only modern techniques, but also historical archives. Another example from the animal feeding project, this is the skull of a squirrel. Is that a deer? Yeah? No? See? A deer. So we looked at, and this is not one squirrel, but many squirrels, and we looked at different populations of squirrels. And this is why we don't have just one squirrel skeleton, one squirrel skull. We have dozens, we have hundreds, is so we can compare different groups. And it turns out that some squirrels in groups in the United Kingdom eat more human food than others. So you can see that on the top bar is the strength of the jaw, and these are different groups of squirrels, and we identified in the middle there squirrels with weak jaws from an area in England called Formby in the north of England, because they had been fed peanuts by the local people over such a long time that they developed biological difference because of the peanuts. So it sounds trivial, it sounds very small, but I use it as an example because we can use these large collections of skeletons and insects and fossils to understand the differences that humans make on the environment, on animal life. And I think that's very important. And it's very political right now, I'm sure, here as well as in the UK, to look at the impact of humans on the natural world. The third example of a research project I want to give is very different again. This uses not the history, not the technology, not the zoology specimens, but our arts and culture from around the globe, our global arts collection, what we might call ethnology, including as well art history. So in the UK, as I'm sure here, we are looking closely at how our collections developed during the period of empire. We're looking at the colonial history of our collections. So that big period with the big buildings, 1880 to 1930, this is of course the big period of the British Empire. And so huge numbers of our collection, a big proportion of our collection, arrives in our museums from the far reaches, from distant parts of the British Empire. And what we wanted to do is to set out to understand more about how those colonial connections, and we're talking about connections today, how the colonial connections connect with our audiences and our communities in the UK today. So this was, again, a project of collaboration with other museums this time, with the Royal Museums Greenwich, which is the National Maritime Museum. And we and the Greenwich Museum were the hub, and we had 8 museums as spokes. So the model is of a wheel, we are the hub, and the other museums are the arms of the wheel. And the aim was to bring different voices, different audiences to museum research. So in the Cold War research, it was historians like me. In the animal feeding research, it was scientists. This project called Exchange, mea culpa, project, not progetti. This is not a proper word. We worked with community groups. We worked with people descended from countries that Britain had conquered as part of the empire. So we worked with people from people whose families were from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And we looked at the themes of empire and migration and what it was like, what it is like, what it was like and what it is like to live in Britain as migrants, as immigrants from different parts of the world. And whereas we have in the other projects, the results were largely traditional in their form. These are books, these are exhibitions, these are scientific papers. With this project, the results were much more flexible. They were small displays, they were small films, they were magazines and poetry. We are continuing to work with these different museums and community groups. And just like with the Cold War, when we look at the audience feedback, with the Exchange project, we're looking at how we are evaluating the process, we are evaluating the methods, and we want to build that into our future research. Do I have 5 minutes still? Gracias. So, these are 3 projects. I will be happy to answer questions, or at least I will try to, on those projects. But I want to think again more generally about the results, the resultados, the outcomes, the outputs of museum research. And we have some examples there. And I am aware that the 3 projects I've given are large projects. They were, we got external funding from large funding bodies for them. But in museums, we research, every curator researches every day, not just for a big project, not just for famous chimpanzees, but for every act of a school group, for every catalogue, for every piece of documentation, we generate new knowledge. So there are famous outputs, famous results like this. These are articles that my colleagues have published in the journal Nature, which is the highest impact journal in the world. And as an example of that, this is, by the way, Dinocephalurus orientalis. Good luck on the translation, but this is a fossil, as you can see, and my colleague helped to discover this fossil. So my colleague discovers dinosaurs. Now, when I sit down and I talk about budgets and I talk about practical things, it's quite difficult to it's difficult to keep your feet on the ground when your colleague discovers dinosaurs. I think that's amazing, but he thinks it's amazing too. What can you do? So my colleague Nick Fraser helped to discover this so-called Chinese dragon. Also in the British newspaper reports, they called it the real Loch Ness monster. But my point is that not only do we discover dinosaurs, we also put together displays. We also catalog our collections. We also acquire new collections. We are given or we buy new collections. And every one of those activities includes research. And so the question then is why we do it. And I should say the research is undertaken not only by dinosaur discovering, but also by all the curators, by our volunteers, by our students, and this is from the collection center. This is our history team working together there. So the question then is why? We research in order to make impact. We research for social impact. We research for environmental impact. And we research for economic impact, for value. And so I will just finish by talking about the work we are doing on our natural science specimens. We are digitizing. So as I said, we have 10 million specimens. We want to digitize. We want to get the data and the images from all of them. This is a big job. But in the UK at least, and I think this is common around the world, of these 2 billion specimens, only 5 to 10% only 5 to 10% of them are catalogued and is the data available. So 95% of the natural science specimens have only dark data, and we want to access these dark data. And after this meeting, I will go on to Madrid to meet natural science directors from around Europe to talk about a project across Europe and with America to try to digitize this material. And one of the reasons we do so is for economic benefit. This, you can just see at a glance, is an impact assessment that the Natural History Museum in London made of the economic impact of collection research. Now, they estimate that the money generated by the research on their collection is around £2 billion, 2 billion UK pounds sterling. Now, you need to think carefully about this. That's making a lot of assumptions. You'll see a lot of that is around agricultural research and around mineral research. And this is over 30 years, 3 decades. But still, £2 billion is enough to make a politician take notice, I think. But my point all along has been, and this is my last slide, my point has been that we are not just about the big research, discovering dinosaurs, making £2 billion or not. Every small act, every small display, and this is a casket, a treasure cask from around 1600 that we put on display, that we researched, we put on display. It had within it the letters from Mary, Queen of Scots. So this is a very magical piece of work. We put it on display and it makes our visitors happy. That's why we research. Thank you very much.
Moltes gràcies, Sam. Tenim una pregunta online per tu. La Maria José Serrano, de València, ens pregunta que li agradaria molt si pots explicar amb una mica més de detall el projecte Change per tal d'entendre una mica millor el seu funcionament.
I don't have my translation in, I'm afraid. I couldn't wear both. Was this a question?
Sí.
From our Digitalis amigo?
Bueno, si voleu algú de la sala, si té alguna pregunta, mentre es va resolent aquest...
I couldn't do it at the same time. Which one? Oh, Exchange. The project Exchange. Or
yes.
Progetti.
Sí.
The project Exchange was a very innovative project where we worked not only with curators but also with community groups. So 8 of the museums around the UK worked with us, and we made grants. We gave research money to these museums to look at different parts of their collections that had come from their colonial roots. I just have some of the details here. So, for example, we worked with the, David Livingstone, this British explorer who spent a lot of time in exploring, so-called discovering Africa. There is a David Livingstone Museum in Scotland. We worked with African communities who live around this museum to look at a material that he brought back with him from his exploration. And of course, David Livingstone did not explore Africa on his own. He had a large group of African people with him, and they uncovered stories from his travels by looking at the other people who traveled with him. Okay. So it's about moving away from a history of museums that just involves, forgive me, dead white men. We want to look at other people as well, and it's all about stories.
Molt bé, moltes gràcies. Espera't, sí, passi de cara.
Gràcies.
No sé si a la sala hi ha alguna pregunta i us podem passar un micro. No? Doncs et donem les gràcies, Sam, per la teva ponència.